Pawn e2 to e4. Pawn e7 to e6. Pawn d2 to d4. Pawn d7 to d5. Knight b1 to c3. Knight g8 to f6. Bishop c1 to g5. Bishop f8 to e7. Pawn e4 to e5. Knight f6 to d7. Bishop g5 takes e7. Queen d8 takes e7. Queen d1 to d2. Castle kingside. Pawn f2 to f4. Pawn c7 to c5. Knight g1 to f3. Knight b8 to c6. Bishop f1 to e2. Pawn f7 to f6. Pawn e5 takes f6. Queen e7 takes f6. Pawn g2 to g3. Knight c6 takes d4. Knight f3 takes d4. Pawn c5 takes d4. Knight c3 to b5. Knight d7 to c5. Knight b5 takes d4. Knight c5 to e4. Queen d2 to e3. Queen f6 to h6. Bishop e2 to d3. Knight e4 to c5. Bishop d3 to b5. Bishop c8 to d7. Castle kingside. Bishop d7 takes b5. Knight d4 takes b5. Pawn b7 to b6. Rook f1 to d1. Pawn a7 to a6. Knight b5 to d4. Queen h6 to f6. Pawn a2 to a4. Rook f8 to e8. Pawn a4 to a5. Pawn e6 to e5. Pawn f4 takes e5. Rook e8 takes e5. Queen e3 to f4. Rook a8 to f8. Pawn a5 takes b6. Queen f6 to d6. Queen f4 to d2. Queen d6 takes b6. Queen d2 to a5. Rook f8 to b8. Queen a5 takes b6. Rook b8 takes b6. Rook a1 to a5. Knight c5 to b7. Rook a5 to a2. Knight b7 to c5. Pawn b2 to b3. Knight c5 to e6. Knight d4 takes e6. Rook b6 takes e6. Rook d1 to d2. King g8 to f7. Rook a2 to a5. Rook e6 to d6. King g1 to g2. Rook d6 to e6. King g2 to f1. Rook e6 to d6. Pawn h2 to h3. King f7 to e6. Rook a5 to c5. Pawn h7 to h5. King f1 to g2. Pawn g7 to g6. Rook c5 to c8. Rook d6 to b6. Rook d2 to f2. King e6 to d7. Rook c8 to a8. Rook b6 to c6. Rook a8 to f8. Rook e5 to e3. Rook f8 to f7, check. King d7 to d6. Rook f7 to f6, check. Rook e3 to e6. Rook f6 to f3. Rook e6 to e1. Rook f3 to f6, check. Rook e1 to e6. Rook f6 to f3. Rook c6 to c5. Rook f3 to f7. Pawn d5 to d4. Rook f7 to a7. King d6 to e5. Rook f2 to e2, check. King e5 to d5. Rook e2 to d2. Rook c5 to c3. Rook a7 to d7, check. King d5 to a5. Rook d7 to d8. Rook e6 to c6. Rook d2 to e2, check. King e5 to f6. Rook d8 to f8, check. King f6 to g7. Rook f8 to f2. Rook c6 to f6. Rook e2 to d2. Pawn g6 to g5. Pawn h3 to h4. Rook f6 takes f2, check. King g2 takes f2. Pawn g5 takes h4. Pawn g3 takes h4. King g7 to f6. Rook d2 takes d4. Rook c3 takes c2, check. King f2 to e3. Rook c2 to b2. King e3 to f4. Rook b2 to f2, check. King f4 to e4. Rook f2 to e2, check. King e4 to f4. Rook e2 to f2, check. King f4 to e4. Rook f2 to e2, check. King e4 to f4. Rook e2 to f2, check. The game is a draw.